What if the most important detail in this case has nothing to do with blood, knives, or locked doors? What if the real story begins with a wire transfer? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. That question alone has been quietly haunting everyone who's followed the Reiner family tragedy. Because from the outside, the narrative felt simple. Too simple. A wealthy Hollywood family. A shocking double homicide. A troubled adult son arrested the same night. Case closed, right? But simple stories rarely survive scrutiny, especially when $50 million allegedly changes hands in the shadows. Let's start here, with a moment that most headlines rushed past. A gated estate in Brentwood. $13.5 million worth of privacy, prestige, and silence. Inside, 2 lives brutally ended. Outside, flashing lights, whispered disbelief, and a neighborhood struggling to understand how violence found its way into a place designed to keep the world out. The initial reports came fast. Names, ages, charges. The son, Nick Reiner, arrested that night. First-degree murder. Shock rippled outward like an aftershock. Friends stunned. Fans confused. Commentators scrambling for meaning. And almost immediately, a narrative formed. A dangerous family member. A troubled mind. A tragic but isolated act. But here's the thing no one could quite explain. Why did this feel prepared? Not staged. Not rehearsed. Prepared. As if events had been anticipated. As if decisions had already been made long before the police arrived. As if someone, somewhere, had already gamed out the worst possible outcome and planned accordingly. Ask yourself this. When families fall apart, it's rarely sudden. It's slow, quiet, behind closed doors. It happens in arguments that don't make the news, in resentments that never get resolved, in money discussions that turn love into leverage. And according to allegations now circulating, this family may have been cracking long before the night everything shattered. Weeks before the murders, there are claims of a confrontation. A moment where words were exchanged that could not be taken back. A moment where Rob Reiner allegedly discovered something that shook the foundation of his trust. Not in a stranger, but in his own family. Inheritance, lies, control. These aren't just financial terms. They're emotional landmines, especially in families where money doesn't just buy comfort, but influence, power, silence. And here's where the story takes its first uncomfortable turn. According to emerging claims, that confrontation didn't end with resolution. It ended with fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of losing control. Fear that the carefully maintained image of unity could fracture in public view. So ask yourself, what do powerful people do when they're cornered? They don't panic. They strategize. And that's where the alleged $50 million comes in. Now, let's be very clear. At this stage, what you're about to hear is not proven fact. It's a narrative pieced together from reported claims, alleged accounts, and whispers that refuse to stay buried. But whispers become louder when patterns start to align. The claim is this. After Rob's alleged confrontation, a massive sum of money was wired to Nick Reiner. $50 million. Not as a gift, not as an inheritance, but as silence. Think about that number for a moment. $50 million doesn't solve a problem. It erases one. It doesn't ask for loyalty. It buys compliance. And if these claims are true, the agreement wasn't just about keeping quiet. It was about contingency, about worst-case scenarios, about what would happen if things spiraled out of control. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. Why would anyone need to pay that much to ensure silence inside their own family? What was Nick allegedly being asked not to say? And more chilling, what was he allegedly being asked to do if the situation collapsed? This is where Jake Reiner enters the story. Until recently, Jake's name barely surfaced. He existed on the periphery, a background figure in a family dominated by bigger personalities and louder narratives. But according to claims now circulating, Jake may have known more than anyone realized. Because silence inside families isn't accidental. It's enforced, sometimes gently, sometimes violently, and sometimes with money so large it becomes its own form of intimidation. Jake's alleged account suggests that what happened next wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a sudden descent into chaos. It was a plan layered with conditions, expectations, and an unspoken understanding that someone would bear the consequences if the plan failed. And if that sounds impossible, ask yourself this. How many times have powerful families survived scandal because someone else took the fall? History is full of examples. Political dynasties, corporate empires, royal households. When image is everything, sacrifice becomes strategy. According to these allegations, Nick Reiner wasn't just seen as a risk. He was seen as a solution, a pressure valve, someone whose instability, struggles, or past behavior could be used to make a future narrative believable. Because if the unthinkable ever happened, the story would already write itself. A dangerous family member, a tragic mental break, an isolated act of violence. Case closed. And here's where it gets even more unsettling. Reports claim the bodies were discovered by Romy Reiner, who allegedly told police about a dangerous family member who should be considered a suspect. That detail matters, because it suggests fear existed before answers did. It suggests that within moments of discovery, someone already knew who law enforcement would look at. And the question no one wants to ask is this: was that knowledge based on reality or on expectation? Because there's a difference between identifying a threat and fulfilling a script. As the media cycle spun, Nick was arrested, charged, and publicly positioned as the sole focus. The story hardened quickly. Public attention narrowed. Sympathy collapsed into certainty. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. Silence. No public family implosions. No chaotic finger-pointing. No competing narratives fighting for dominance. Just quiet cooperation with the version of events everyone was being handed. And that's often the biggest red flag of all. Families in shock don't behave neatly, unless they've rehearsed the possibility. Now ask yourself this: if there truly was an alleged agreement, a silence pact, who benefits most from it holding? Who walks away protected? Who keeps their reputation intact? Who avoids scrutiny? And who ends up alone, carrying the full weight of blame? These questions aren't comfortable. They aren't easy, and they certainly aren't popular, but they're necessary. Because if Jake Reiner's alleged account is even partially accurate, then this story isn't about a single night of violence. It's about years of control, years of fear, years of decisions made behind closed doors where money replaced morality. And the most disturbing possibility of all, that the tragedy didn't begin with rage. It began with planning. As we move forward, we're going to slow this story down, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, decision by decision. We're going to examine the family dynamics that allegedly set this in motion, the confrontation that lit the fuse, and the financial maneuver that may have sealed everyone's fate. But before we can understand the alleged pact, the alleged payment, or the alleged plan, we have to understand the family itself. Because no agreement like this is born overnight. It grows in silence. And what came next would expose just how fragile that silence really was, and how close this family already was to collapse. What does it look like when a family is everything? Not just wealth, not just fame, but the kind of legacy that people write stories about. The Reiners, to the public eye, seem to live inside that perfect narrative. A sprawling Brentwood estate, Hollywood connections, generations of recognition. And yet, as we've learned from countless stories like theirs, perfection is often the loudest lie. The Reiners' public image was immaculate. Guests photographed on manicured lawns, charity events meticulously documented, appearances on talk shows that radiated warmth and charm. People who watched them from afar would assume a family united, harmonious, and prosperous. But appearances, as anyone who has ever been part of such a family knows, can be a cage. The more flawless the image, the tighter the pressure inside. From outside the gates, one might have assumed that Nick Reiner, the son who was arrested, lived a life of comfort. A guest house within a multi-million-dollar estate, access to endless resources, opportunities for education, connections to the film industry. Everything a person could want. And yet, wealth is not a buffer against personal struggles. Nor is it a shield from family expectations, comparisons, and conflicts that simmer quietly until they boil over. To understand what allegedly unfolded, we have to look past the facade. Behind every polished photograph, there are stories left untold. Small arguments turned into cold silences. Decisions made to preserve appearances, even when they hurt the people involved. Wealth doesn't erase tension. It magnifies it. A forgotten birthday can become a public slight. A minor insult becomes a ripple that stretches across years. In this case, The alleged tension centered around power and inheritance. Claims have surfaced suggesting that Nick was considered problematic long before that fatal night. Whether due to mental health struggles, impulsive behavior, or merely being the middle child in a family of achievers, the narrative that began forming quietly around him was troubling. He was often cast as the unstable one, the one who could threaten the family's equilibrium if unchecked. And then there was Tracy Reiner. Allegedly, she was the family strategist. Calm, calculating, the person who would smooth over conflicts, manage appearances, and ensure the family remained in the public eye unscathed. In families with immense wealth, someone like this is often the linchpin. Someone whose decisions determine who stays in favor, who is disciplined quietly, and who is excluded when necessary. A fixer, some would say. And in this story, her alleged influence over both Nick and other family members would later become central. Yet the very wealth and visibility that should have protected the family only amplified the stakes. When everything you own, everything you inherit, and every relationship is measured in dollars and public perception, every disagreement carries a weight that is almost impossible for outsiders to understand. What might seem minor in a less prominent family becomes monumental here. A disagreement over an inheritance, for example, isn't just about money. It's about trust, legacy, and power. Nick's position in this family appears to have been complicated. Reports claim that he struggled to find his footing under the shadow of a father known for success and siblings who seemingly adhered to the rules. In such environments, even small missteps can create lasting rifts. And in families with public profiles, missteps don't remain private. Every move is scrutinized, every reaction dissected. Every conversation is potentially a story waiting to leak. Allegedly, these pressures created a pattern where Nick's actions and decisions became a liability. Whether he was aware of it or not, the family narrative was already constructing him as the person who could be controlled, or, if necessary, sacrificed. And within this environment, even those who loved him could see him as a risk. From the outside, of course, none of this was visible. To fans, neighbors, or casual observers, the Reiners seemed untouchable. But inside, reports claimed the golden veneer was brittle. Arguments that might have been resolved with open conversation were instead buried. Frustrations over money, control, and image were funneled into silence, with consequences only realized years later. It's important to emphasize that the alleged fractures in the family didn't appear overnight. They developed slowly, like cracks in a glass window. At first, no one noticed. At first, no one cared. But each small disagreement, each minor resentment, and each unspoken grievance added to a pressure that would eventually explode. This tension reached its peak in what has been described as a confrontation, a moment when Rob Reiner allegedly discovered discrepancies in promises made to family members. This discovery, small as it might have seemed to outsiders, carried enormous weight within the family. It wasn't just about money. It was about trust, reputation, and authority. The confrontation, allegedly, forced decisions that would ripple outward, affecting each member differently. In families with wealth, the stakes of these confrontations are magnified. What might seem like a personal argument can have long-term financial implications. What begins as a disagreement over behavior or inheritance can evolve into a legal, emotional, and public crisis. And it is here that wealth, rather than protecting a family, can make every misstep more consequential. Tracy Reiner's alleged role in these events is particularly striking. Reports suggest she had the ability to manage both perception and reality, steering the family's narrative to her advantage. A word of caution, a carefully timed payment, or a strategic conversation could ensure that public image remained intact even as private tensions escalated. In such scenarios, money becomes more than wealth. It becomes influence, leverage, and protection. As these dynamics unfolded, Nick's position reportedly became increasingly precarious. Viewed as both a liability and a tool, he allegedly found himself in situations where his actions were anticipated, monitored, and, ultimately, manipulated. In such an environment, personal agency can feel like an illusion. You are allowed to move, but only within the parameters someone else has set. And yet, all this was happening quietly. The golden image persisted. Friends, colleagues, and the public saw celebrations, smiles, and appearances of unity. Few could imagine the underlying pressure. Fewer could imagine that the cracks in the family's facade were widening toward an unthinkable collapse. It is worth asking, then, how often do we mistake wealth and image for stability? How often do we assume that a family with money and influence is free from the same struggles, betrayals, and tensions that plague ordinary households? The Reiner's case is a stark reminder that appearances can deceive, that underneath the most polished exterior, complicated, messy, and sometimes dangerous dynamics can thrive. This, then, sets the stage for what allegedly unfolded in the days leading to the tragic events. A family whose image was untouchable, whose wealth could command respect, and whose secrets were carefully guarded was facing pressures no amount of money could entirely contain. Every member had a role, every word carried weight, and every decision could have consequences far beyond what anyone imagined. As we move to the next chapter, we'll explore the confrontation that allegedly lit the fuse, the moment when private tensions collided with public stakes, the conversation that, according to reports, triggered the chain of events leading to a $50 million transfer, a tragic night of violence, and a family left in ruin. What happens when a family reaches the point where words are more dangerous than weapons? For the Reiners, that moment is said to have arrived quietly, behind the locked doors of the Brentwood estate. Reports claim that Rob Reiner, a figure admired for decades in Hollywood, discovered discrepancies that shook him to his core. Allegedly, what he uncovered wasn't a minor oversight or a harmless misunderstanding. It was something far more significant. Something that, if left unchecked, threatened both the family's reputation and the carefully maintained balance of wealth and trust. What exactly was discovered remains unclear, but sources claim the confrontation revolved around inheritance, unfulfilled promises, and financial maneuvering that some alleged family members wanted kept hidden. Imagine sitting at a dining table with someone you trust entirely, only to realize that the trust was conditional, that unspoken deals were being made behind your back. For Rob, this alleged realization reportedly triggered a confrontation that would echo through every corner of the family's life. According to accounts circulating now, Rob confronted Tracy Reiner first. In that confrontation, he allegedly demanded clarity. Answers about money, about promises, about the alleged manipulation of financial and personal information. Some reports suggest that Rob had been piecing together a complex web of transactions and communications, a pattern that pointed toward deception. But confrontation is risky. In families like the Reiners, confrontation can ripple outward, creating waves that touch every member, intentionally or not. The alleged tension in the room was palpable. Emotions ran high. Words were exchanged that could not be taken back. Some witnesses claim that Tracy remained calm, collected, as though she had anticipated this moment for months, maybe years. Others suggest she may have used her influence and strategic thinking to steer the conversation away from outright admission while still subtly asserting control. The dynamic in the room, as alleged, was not that of equals confronting a problem. It was a chess match. Every statement, every hesitation, every glance had meaning. Nick Reiner, according to some accounts, was present or immediately aware of the confrontation. His role in this moment is crucial to understanding what allegedly followed. If these reports are accurate, he was positioned in a way that made him both observer and participant. Whether he was actively involved in the alleged deception or merely aware of it, the outcome of the confrontation allegedly set the stage for the next series of events. Think for a moment about what it must feel like to witness the head of a household confronting someone you have always relied on for guidance, strategy, or protection. To realize that the carefully constructed rules of engagement have changed overnight. That loyalty, trust, and control are suddenly in question. This, according to emerging narratives, is precisely where the Reiners found themselves. What happened next, sources suggest, was not a simple argument. It was a pivotal moment in which choices were made, decisions that would have repercussions far beyond the room in which they occurred. One such decision, alleged but widely reported, was a financial maneuver intended to secure compliance, the transfer of $50 million. $50 million. That figure alone is staggering. And it raises questions that no one could ignore. Was this a gift? A bribe? A strategic payment to ensure silence and loyalty? According to claims, it was all of the above. But here's the crucial point. If this transfer did occur, it was not intended to reward. It was intended to protect, to control, to create a safety net in case the consequences of confrontation became too volatile. In families with wealth, power, and influence, money is often more than currency. It is leverage. It is protection. And in some cases, it is a tool to shape behavior. The idea, according to the allegations, was simple in theory but complex in execution. Ensure that Nick Reiner would remain silent, comply with expectations, and, if necessary, accept responsibility for outcomes that could harm others. It is chilling to consider because it suggests that the tragedy was, in some ways, anticipated before it ever occurred. The plan, the conditions, the contingencies, all were allegedly in place long before the first act of violence. Ask yourself, what does it mean for a family when financial agreements are used to dictate behavior in life and death situations? When does protection become coercion? When does love become leverage? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are central to understanding the alleged dynamics at play in the Reiner family. And then there is the psychological dimension. According to some reports, Nick Reiner was already struggling with emotional and mental health challenges. The confrontation, combined with the pressure of expectations, may have exacerbated these challenges. Allegedly, he was placed in a situation where he was both beholden to the family's strategic decisions and burdened by personal vulnerabilities. The intersection of financial manipulation, family loyalty, and personal struggle created a situation in which every decision carried extraordinary weight. From a strategic perspective, Tracy Reiner's alleged role cannot be understated. If she orchestrated or facilitated the transfer, she not only attempted to mitigate immediate risk but also positioned herself to maintain control over how events were interpreted afterward. The family's public image, after all, was at stake. Reputation in a wealthy, connected family is a form of currency as valuable as money itself. And according to claims, Tracy allegedly understood that very well. It is difficult, even with careful reconstruction, to fully grasp the emotional intensity of the confrontation. Imagine being at the center of a storm you cannot control, where every word could escalate tension or trigger consequences. Imagine knowing that decisions made in a single conversation could reverberate through every corner of your life for years to come. For the Reiners, according to reports, that was the reality. As tensions escalated, the alleged decisions made during this confrontation set a precedent. They established a hierarchy of responsibility and accountability. They clarified who would be shielded, who would be expected to comply, and who might bear the brunt if plans failed. It is in this context that the subsequent events, including the alleged financial transfer and the ultimate tragedy, must be understood. Of course, no family confrontation exists in isolation. Actions have consequences, and reactions often exceed expectations. According to allegations, the confrontation did not resolve the underlying tension. Instead, it escalated the stakes. Decisions made during that moment created pressures that could not easily be reversed. And when the pressure reached a breaking point, the outcome, according to reports, was devastating. The confrontation also illustrates the intersection of personal, emotional, and financial stakes in families with wealth. It was not merely a disagreement over money. It was a collision of trust, control, and survival instincts. Allegedly, those involved were making decisions that balanced loyalty, risk, and long-term strategy. And in families where wealth and reputation are intertwined, the consequences of miscalculations can be catastrophic. Finally, consider this. The confrontation reportedly took place not long before the tragic events that made headlines. Timing is critical. It suggests a narrow window in which decisions, threats, and contingencies were put into motion. It suggests that the events of that night were, in some ways, the culmination of a carefully orchestrated tension. And it raises the most unsettling question of all. If the confrontation set the stage, how much of the subsequent tragedy was reactive, and how much was, allegedly, anticipated? In the next chapter, we will examine the alleged $50 million transfer in detail. How it supposedly functioned as both incentive and contingency. How money, Influence and family loyalty converged to create a situation in which tragedy became almost inevitable. We'll trace the flow of funds, examine timing, and explore why this single financial action may hold the key to understanding everything that followed. But what came next would push the family into uncharted territory, and it would become impossible to separate loyalty from survival. $50 million. Say it slowly. Let it sink in. $50 million. It's almost impossible to grasp the scale of that sum in ordinary life. But in the context of the Reiner family, according to emerging claims, it wasn't merely wealth, it was leverage, control, and a binding agreement all rolled into one. What does one do with $50 million when it's offered not as a gift, but as a guarantee of silence? How does a person process an amount of money that could secure lifetimes of comfort, yet comes attached with conditions that could carry unimaginable consequences? These are the questions at the heart of the Reiner story. Because, allegedly, this transaction was far more than a transfer of funds. It was the manifestation of a family dynamic in which money replaced trust, influence replaced love, and compliance became currency. According to reports, the transfer did not happen impulsively. Allegedly, it was meticulously planned. The sum was wired, not in small increments, but as a single, undeniable transfer, a figure large enough to signal both seriousness and authority. $50 million is a statement. It says, we have power, we have resources, we have control, and you, Nick Reiner, are now bound by that control. The timing of the alleged transfer is critical. Sources suggest it occurred shortly after the confrontation between Rob and Tracy. It was, ostensibly, a direct response to the confrontation's revelations, an attempt to manage the fallout before it spiraled beyond anyone's control. But the question that immediately arises is this: why so much? Why not a lesser amount? Why risk such a massive transfer when what was at stake could have been addressed through conversation, mediation, or other traditional methods? Some speculate that the size of the payment was intentional. $50 million doesn't just influence behavior. It intimidates. It signals the seriousness of expectations. Allegedly, the sum was structured to create a sense of obligation that went beyond normal familial loyalty. It was a psychological lever. Comply, remain silent, and the reward is immense. Resist, challenge, or reveal secrets, and the consequences, both emotional and legal, could be catastrophic. It's worth stepping back for a moment to consider the logistics. Wiring $50 million is not trivial. Banks flag these transfers. Legal teams question them. Records exist, always. And yet, according to the narrative, this payment was made in a manner intended to remain largely invisible to the public eye. Carefully orchestrated, quietly executed, designed to ensure that only the intended parties were fully aware. That level of planning, some argue, indicates foresight and premeditation, even if the exact legal ramifications are murky. But what does one do with money that comes with a condition as severe as alleged silence? According to reports, Nick Reiner was expected not merely to accept the funds but to adhere to an agreement, allegedly verbal, perhaps even written in some confidential form, that dictated behavior in extreme circumstances. It wasn't simply a promise to stay quiet. It was a framework for what would happen if events spiraled. According to sources, the agreement may have included accepting responsibility for actions beyond his control should a situation deteriorate. Imagine, for a moment, the mental calculus involved. $50 million in exchange for compliance, in exchange for secrecy, in exchange for assuming potential blame for circumstances that could emerge unexpectedly. Even for someone familiar with pressure or high-stakes decisions, that is a psychological burden few could carry lightly. And yet, allegedly, the agreement was accepted. The conditions were understood. The potential consequences were acknowledged. Some observers have noted the irony in this arrangement. Money, which can solve almost any problem in practical terms, cannot address the emotional strain or ethical dilemmas involved. One can have every financial security imaginable, but still be trapped in a web of obligations that compromise personal freedom, relationships, and moral clarity. Allegedly, Nick was caught in precisely this paradox. At the same time, the payment reportedly served a dual purpose. It was both incentive and contingency. By offering an enormous sum, The family allegedly ensured that Nick had reason to comply, but it also created a built-in fallback plan. If anything went wrong, the family could claim that the boundaries and responsibilities had been clearly established. In other words, the $50 million acted not only as a tool to secure silence, but also as a mechanism to allocate blame in advance. Consider the broader implications. In families with significant wealth, such arrangements are not always rare. Money becomes a language of power. It is a way to manage conflicts without public exposure. But in this case, the alleged stakes were higher than typical family disagreements. Lives, reputations, and legacies were intertwined with compliance, secrecy, and financial leverage. It was no longer merely about protecting an image. It was about controlling outcomes that could be catastrophic if left unchecked. And there is another layer: perception. To the outside world, the Reiners were a family devastated by an inexplicable tragedy. But if the $50 million transaction was real, then there is a hidden narrative. One in which decisions were made proactively to manage risk, even before the public knew there was a problem. It's a stark reminder that what appears chaotic on the surface may have been carefully orchestrated behind closed doors. This alleged transfer also raises questions about agency and choice. How much of Nick Reiner's behavior in the days, weeks, or months following the payment was influenced by obligation versus genuine intent? How much of the tragedy, if we follow this line of reasoning, was shaped not by impulse, but by prior agreements and conditions? These are uncomfortable questions, yet they are central to understanding the reported dynamics. The financial dimension intersects with the psychological in ways that are difficult to untangle. Money, power, and obligation can amplify stress, paranoia, and fear. According to claims, this intersection may have played a critical role in the events that followed. The alleged $50 million was not merely a transaction. It was a lever, a weight, a responsibility. And in families with intense internal pressures, such burdens can have unforeseen consequences. And yet, while the transfer may have been designed to prevent disaster, it also appears to have created new pressures. Allegedly, the conditions of the agreement left Nick in a position where compliance and personal safety were entwined in dangerous ways. Every choice he made after that moment, every action or inaction, would have been viewed through the lens of this financial arrangement. According to reports, it was a framework that limited flexibility while magnifying risk, an invisible chain linking wealth, expectation, and potential culpability. Finally, consider the broader ripple effects. Allegedly, other family members were aware of the payment, its purpose, and the expectations attached. The transfer didn't exist in isolation. It existed within a network of awareness, observation, and unspoken rules. This network, according to emerging claims, set the stage for both cooperation and conflict, compliance and concealment, loyalty and betrayal. The $50 million was, in a sense, the central axis around which the rest of the tragedy revolved. In the next chapter, we will explore the so-called Silence Pact itself. The explicit and implicit agreements that allegedly followed the transfer, the responsibilities imposed on Nick, and the psychological and strategic calculus that governed every move. We'll trace the contours of loyalty, obligation, and leverage, examining how financial incentives, family power, and fear intersected in ways that may have made tragedy almost inevitable. But what came next would reveal that money alone could not guarantee control. And the consequences of that realization would be devastating. Silence isn't just the absence of sound. In families like the Reiners, silence can be a strategy, a contract, a tool for survival. And according to reports, that is exactly what the so-called Silence Pact was: an unspoken, and perhaps partially documented, agreement designed to keep dangerous truths contained, to manage behavior, and to allocate accountability before anything went wrong. The term pact itself suggests formality. Even if informal, it implies a shared understanding that cannot easily be broken. And in this case, the alleged pact reportedly came into being after the confrontation and the massive financial transfer. $50 million wasn't just a number. It was the catalyst for an agreement, the tangible anchor of a conditional promise, compliance in exchange for protection, or, as some reports claim, the willingness to shoulder consequences if events spiraled. Imagine, for a moment, the psychological weight of this arrangement. Money that large carries enormous temptation, but when combined with obligation, fear, and potential blame, it becomes something else entirely. According to emerging claims, Nick Reiner wasn't simply receiving a windfall. He was entering a framework that dictated behavior under extreme circumstances. Allegedly, he was asked to remain silent, to adhere to unspoken rules, and, in some scenarios, to accept responsibility if any plan failed. Silence, in this context, was not passive. It required active maintenance. It demanded constant awareness of consequences, careful navigation of conversations, and disciplined restraint in moments of emotional strain. Allegedly, the pact wasn't merely a safeguard for the family's public image. It was a control mechanism, binding Nick to expectations that may have been impossible to fully meet. The mechanics of the alleged agreement are murky by design. Reports suggest that it may have included verbal stipulations reinforced by the financial transfer, creating both incentive and deterrent. Compliance meant retaining the $50 million and, presumably, avoiding legal or familial retaliation. Breach, on the other hand, could carry catastrophic consequences emotionally, legally, and financially. In other words, the pact was both a promise and a threat, a dual-edged sword that required careful balancing. It's worth noting that this kind of arrangement, while shocking in scale, is not unheard of in wealthy or high-profile families. History shows us countless examples of agreements designed to control narratives, silence dissent, and preserve legacy. But what allegedly makes this case extraordinary is the combination of psychological pressure, financial incentive, and familial relationships under one roof. Allegedly, it transformed routine family dynamics into a high-stakes negotiation where failure was not an option. According to reports, the alleged pact also blurred lines between voluntary compliance and coercion. Nick Reiner, already under intense scrutiny for personal struggles, was allegedly placed in a position where the stakes were not just monetary but existential. Every choice, every conversation, every action could be interpreted through the lens of the pact. And the more pressure he felt to comply, the greater the risk of breakdown, misjudgment, or unintended consequences. Some observers have noted the irony in the situation. The very tool designed to protect the family, money combined with strategic expectation, may have simultaneously created the conditions for tragedy. It is a paradox in which control begets instability, and attempts to prevent chaos may accelerate it. Allegedly, the pact established a framework that was difficult, if not impossible, to navigate without error. Beyond the individual, the alleged pact also influenced the family dynamic as a whole. Other members, including Tracy and possibly Jake, were reportedly aware of its conditions and expectations. Awareness, in this context, is a form of power. Knowledge of the terms created leverage, both psychological and practical. It allowed certain family members to anticipate reactions, shape behavior, and maintain influence without overt coercion. In effect, the pact became a silent conductor, orchestrating interactions, decisions, and even emotional responses. The stakes of the agreement are made even clearer when one considers the environment in which it existed. A wealthy, high-profile family does not operate in isolation. External pressures, media scrutiny, legal considerations, public perception add layers of complexity. Allegedly, the pact was designed not only to manage internal dynamics, but also to control exposure to the outside world. Every choice was measured against potential consequences for reputation, legacy, and public narrative. It's important to emphasize that this is not simply a story of money or manipulation. Allegedly, it is a story of emotional and psychological calculation, of strategic foresight, and of the precarious balance between loyalty and self-preservation. The pact, if it existed as reported, required constant awareness, constant vigilance, and careful adherence to unspoken rules. Failure to observe these rules could result in outcomes far more severe than financial loss. Reports also suggest that the alleged pact created moral and ethical dilemmas. When compliance is purchased and responsibility is pre-allocated, personal agency becomes limited. Allegedly, Nick was in a position where every action or inaction carried moral weight, yet was circumscribed by obligation. Every instinct to act freely, to question, or to resist could be interpreted as a violation. In essence, the pact transformed everyday decisions into high-stakes calculations with no room for error. And yet, silence is fragile. Even the most carefully constructed agreements are vulnerable to miscommunication, emotional pressure, and human fallibility. Allegedly, the very conditions designed to maintain control may have contributed to a breakdown. The weight of expectation, coupled with financial leverage and family dynamics, reportedly created an environment in which stress and fear could escalate beyond containment. As we consider the implications, we must ask the difficult questions. Can money truly control behavior in situations where emotion, loyalty, and fear intersect? How much pressure is too much before a person reacts unpredictably? And when silence is enforced through financial means, at what point does obligation become coercion? These questions are central to understanding the alleged dynamics of the Reiner family in the days and weeks leading to tragedy. Finally, the alleged silence pact serves as a lens through which to view the subsequent events. It establishes a framework that explains potential motivations, behavioral constraints, and psychological pressure points. While we may never have access to all the details, the claims paint a picture of a family navigating extraordinary circumstances with extraordinary measures, using money, influence, and expectation as tools to manage both risk and exposure. In the next chapter, we will examine Nick Reiner's position within this complex web. Was he a pawn, a participant, or both? How did the alleged pact influence his actions, decisions, and vulnerabilities? And how did the interplay of financial leverage, emotional pressure, and family loyalty shape the path that ultimately led to tragedy? But what came next would reveal that even the most carefully constructed pact could not contain the consequences. And that silence, no matter how meticulously purchased, has its limits. Who really held the power in the Reiner family? Was it the parents, orchestrating outcomes from the shadows? Or was it Nick, caught between expectation and obligation, whose every move became both strategy and vulnerability? This is the central question in understanding the tragedy, and it is one that refuses easy answers. From the outside, Nick Reiner's life seemed enviable. Wealth, connections, family legacy, and access to opportunities few could imagine. Yet wealth alone does not insulate a person from pressure, expectation, or internal family dynamics. Reports suggest that Nick's position in the family was complicated, precarious, and, in some ways, orchestrated to maintain balance. Allegedly, Nick was simultaneously the person who could be controlled and the person who could be blamed. He was described as the problem child in some accounts. Not necessarily because of inherent danger, but because his actions were predictable under stress. That predictability, paradoxically, made him both a liability and an asset. Families with wealth and legacy often operate this way. Someone absorbs risk, so others can maintain stability. Consider the psychological weight of such a role. According to emerging reports, Nick was navigating not only family expectations, but also personal struggles. Mental health challenges, emotional volatility, and stress were reportedly factors in how he processed the world around him. If these reports are accurate, the alleged silence pact and financial arrangements added another layer of obligation and pressure, creating an environment where mistakes, or perceived mistakes, could have catastrophic consequences. Allegedly, Nick was expected to adhere to rules that were both explicit and unspoken. Compliance meant financial reward and family acceptance. Deviation meant personal and legal risk. It's a high-stakes equation with no margin for error. Every decision, every interaction, every slip of judgment could be interpreted as a breach. In families like this, perception becomes reality, and the line between intentional and accidental actions blurs. Yet reports also suggest that Nick was not merely passive. As alleged, he was aware of the pact's conditions and had accepted the obligations tied to the $50 million transfer. Whether this acceptance was voluntary or coerced is unclear, and therein lies the tension between pawn and participant. A pawn can be moved without agency, but a participant acts within constrained choice. According to claims, Nick may have operated somewhere in between, aware of expectations, motivated by reward and fear, and making choices that could simultaneously serve the family and place him at risk. it is worth examining how family dynamics shape such positions. Allegedly, parents like Rob and Tracy wield influence not only through authority, but through leverage, emotional, social, and financial. Nick's behavior, as observed by family members, was reportedly both monitored and anticipated. This anticipation creates a self-fulfilling cycle. If someone expects misbehavior or instability, they may structure interactions in ways that provoke or constrain it. Allegedly, this is exactly what happened with Nick. And yet, while some narratives cast him as a pawn, others suggest he exercised agency. Sources claim that Nick was not entirely passive in responding to family pressures. Allegedly, he made decisions about compliance, financial interactions, and communication that reflected strategic thinking within the confines of the pact. If true, this challenges the idea that he was merely a tool. It suggests he was also a participant in shaping outcomes, albeit under extreme constraints. The paradox of Nick's position lies in the duality of control. On one hand, he was subject to family expectations, legal oversight, and the psychological weight of the pact. On the other, he reportedly had enough awareness and autonomy to influence events, navigate relationships, and respond strategically to pressure. This duality, if accurately reported, illustrates how tragedy can emerge from complexity. When someone is both guided and constrained, the space for error is narrow, and the consequences are amplified. Consider the emotional and psychological consequences of such a position. Allegedly, Nick lived under constant scrutiny, aware that failure to comply or perceived deviation could carry devastating personal consequences. The mental calculus required to navigate this environment is immense. Balancing loyalty with self-preservation, ethical considerations with pragmatic necessity, and emotional stability with relentless pressure. According to reports, these factors may have contributed to behavior that, on the surface, seemed irrational or dangerous but was, in context, tragically predictable. This also raises questions about moral responsibility. When someone operates under extreme pressure and structured obligation, how much agency do they truly have? How much of their behavior is self-determined, and how much is shaped by external forces? Allegedly, Nick's situation exemplifies the difficulty of drawing clear lines between intent, compliance, and coercion. Families with wealth and internal politics often create environments where blame and responsibility are pre-allocated, leaving individuals in morally ambiguous positions. Moreover, the intersection of money, leverage, and familial expectation is particularly potent in the Reiner case. $50 million was not simply a financial transaction. It was a psychological instrument. According to reports, it created incentives to comply, conditions to fear, and a framework in which every action had potential consequences. The alleged silence pact did not merely guide behavior. It constrained it, amplified it, and made deviation perilous. Yet, even under these conditions, the reports suggest that Nick retained some capacity for decision-making. Allegedly, he navigated interactions with family members, managed communications regarding sensitive topics, and attempted to maintain compliance with the terms of the pact. Whether his actions were ultimately effective is another question, and one that grows darker when considering the events that followed. In families like this, perception is reality. Allegedly, other family members monitored Nick closely, interpreting his behavior as either compliance or defiance. Missteps, whether intentional or accidental, could be magnified. And in a system structured around leverage and expectation, even small deviations can have outsized consequences. The alleged silence pact, combined with the $50 million transfer, created a scenario in which Nick's every move carried extraordinary significance. It is also important to note that Nick's position may have been compounded by isolation. Allegedly, the pact and the financial transfer created barriers between him and external support, limiting opportunities for advice, intervention, or emotional relief. In such environments, stress accumulates, pressure intensifies, and the probability of extreme outcomes rises. According to some reports, this was a crucial factor in the tragic sequence of events that would soon unfold. Finally, consider the role of agency in the narrative. Was Nick Reiner merely a pawn, moved at the whim of family strategy? Or was he an active participant, navigating obligations and expectations with awareness of consequences? Allegedly, he was both. He was constrained by external factors and yet responsible for his choices within those constraints. He was the intersection of compliance and action, obligation and influence, fear and strategy. And in that intersection, tragedy found fertile ground. In the next chapter, we will focus on Tracy Reiner's alleged role as the orchestrator behind much of this dynamic. We'll examine how influence, leverage, and strategic decision-making shaped the family environment, and how these factors may have affected Nick's behavior. We will explore the tension between control and consequence, and how a person in Tracy's position could simultaneously protect and manipulate outcomes. But what came next would make it painfully clear that even careful orchestration cannot fully anticipate human emotion, and the results would be devastating. In families like the Reiners, power isn't always about money, titles, or public recognition. Often, it's subtle, psychological, and nearly invisible. Allegedly, Tracy Reiner wielded this kind of influence, a control that did not require force, yet could determine outcomes, shape behavior, and dictate who bore consequences. Some observers describe it as control without blood, a power exercised quietly but decisively behind closed doors. Tracy's alleged role in the family was multifaceted. On the surface, she appeared composed, calm, and articulate, a stabilizing presence amidst wealth, fame, and complex family dynamics. To the outside world, she maintained the public image of unity, compassion, and grace. Yet, according to emerging reports, beneath that veneer lay a strategist, someone who understood the levers of influence, the limits of authority, and the consequences of unspoken agreements. The alleged $50 million transfer to Nick Reiner is central to understanding her influence. Some reports suggest that she orchestrated the payment, framing it not as a gift, but as leverage, a means to enforce compliance, to ensure silence, and to allocate potential responsibility in advance. It was, allegedly, both shield and sword, protection for the family's image and a subtle instrument of control over a member whose behavior could destabilize everything. What does it mean to control without force? It means shaping the environment so that outcomes align with your objectives. It means understanding motivations, fears, and vulnerabilities. It means ensuring that the people around you act in ways that serve your strategic interests, often without their conscious awareness. Allegedly, Tracy's influence extended into nearly every facet of the family dynamic. Every conversation, every financial decision, and every expectation may have been subtly guided, creating a system in which her objectives were reinforced without direct confrontation. Consider the psychology of such control. If someone feels obligated, indebted, or fearful, they may comply with expectations even when they conflict with personal desires or instincts. Money, influence, and reputation become tools to shape behavior. Allegedly, the Silence Pact and the $50 million transfer were manifestations of this strategy. Nick Reiner, positioned at the center of these pressures, may have been guided in ways both subtle and overt, navigating expectations while under enormous stress. Some reports suggest that Tracy's strategic oversight went beyond Nick. Allegedly, she maintained a framework of observation and influence over other family members as well, anticipating responses, guiding interactions, and ensuring that the family narrative remained under control. This is control without blood. Outcomes were shaped, consequences were allocated, and risk was mitigated, all without overt aggression, yet with effects potentially as profound as any physical intervention. It is worth asking, how does such control intersect with morality, loyalty, and consequence? Allegedly, Tracy's decisions placed Nick in positions where compliance was financially incentivized but psychologically taxing. Obedience became both survival and obligation. Allegedly, the very mechanisms designed to prevent disaster, financial leverage, strategic guidance, and the Silence Pact, may have increased vulnerability, heightening stress and creating conditions in which tragedy became more likely. At the same time, reports suggest that her influence was both reactive and proactive. She allegedly anticipated potential crises, structured agreements in advance, and positioned herself to manage outcomes. This foresight may have allowed her to protect public image, preserve family legacy, and mitigate some risks, but it also required careful orchestration of behavior and expectation. In other words, control came at a cost. A psychological and emotional burden imposed on those under her influence. Allegedly, Tracy understood the delicate balance between loyalty and fear. She is said to have used financial leverage strategically, maintaining compliance without overt coercion, yet leaving room for interpretation. Nick's every action, according to these claims, would be viewed in light of obligations, incentives, and unspoken rules. This is the essence of control without blood. Shaping behavior indirectly, but with profound effect. It's also worth considering the role of perception. To observers, a family with wealth, education, and public stature may appear harmonious and cohesive. But control without blood operates precisely in this space. Public appearance remains positive, while private influence dictates behavior. Allegedly, Tracy's management of these dynamics ensured that public perception remained untarnished, even as internal pressures mounted. The ethical dimension is striking. Allegedly, she was simultaneously protector, influencer, and strategist. Her decisions may have shielded some members from scrutiny while placing others under intense pressure. The boundaries between guidance and manipulation blur in such arrangements. The larger question becomes, when influence dictates outcomes, who bears responsibility for consequences, especially when tragedy occurs? Reports further suggest that Tracy's strategic oversight extended to anticipating external scrutiny. Wealthy families are rarely insulated from media, legal systems, or public curiosity. Allegedly, every decision, every financial transfer, every private discussion, every enforcement of the Silence Pact was made with consideration of how it would be interpreted if exposed. This is the kind of foresight that separates reactive behavior from premeditated strategy. Yet even the most meticulous strategies cannot fully account for human emotion. Allegedly, the mechanisms of control, influence, and obligation placed immense psychological strain on those involved. Fear, guilt, and pressure accumulated over time, creating conditions in which stress could overwhelm even carefully planned systems. Control without blood is powerful, but it is not infallible. People are unpredictable, emotions are volatile, and circumstances can escalate in ways no one anticipates. It is here that the alleged tragedy intersects with strategic influence. According to reports, Tracy's orchestration may have inadvertently contributed to the very outcomes she sought to prevent. By shaping behavior through obligation, incentive, and expectation, she created a delicate balance that left little room for error. In complex family systems, such orchestration can magnify risk as much as it mitigates it. Finally, consider the duality of her position. Allegedly, Tracy acted both to preserve and to control, to protect legacy and to manage risk, to influence behavior and to shield herself. Control without blood is subtle, effective, and ethically ambiguous. In the Reiner family narrative, it is this dynamic, strategic influence, psychological leverage, and calculated foresight that may have set the stage for subsequent events. In the next chapter, we will explore the first signs of breakdown within the family. The escalating tensions, miscommunications, and pressures that allegedly culminated in the tragic events. We'll examine how control, obligation, and fear interacted to create a tipping point. But what came next would reveal that even the most carefully executed strategies cannot fully contain human volatility, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Every family has its secrets. Every family has tensions, disagreements, and moments that are carefully hidden from the public eye. But in families like the Reiners, the stakes are higher, the secrets larger, and the pressure to maintain appearances absolute. And yet, even the most carefully crafted facade cannot remain unbroken forever. According to reports, the Reiner family's golden image began to show cracks long before the tragic events that shocked the world. The first signs, allegedly, were subtle. Small arguments, fleeting frustrations, and unspoken resentments that were brushed aside to maintain harmony. On the surface, everything appeared perfect. Guests were welcomed with smiles, family photos radiated warmth, and public appearances suggested unity. But behind closed doors, tensions were simmering. Conflicts over money, obligations, and personal behavior reportedly created invisible fault lines. According to emerging narratives, these cracks were amplified by the alleged silence pact and the $50 million transfer. Nick Reiner, caught in a web of financial obligation and emotional pressure, may have begun exhibiting behaviors influenced by stress, anxiety, and the impossibility of meeting expectations. When compliance is enforced through money and fear, stress doesn't dissipate, it accumulates. Allegedly, this accumulation of pressure contributed to the destabilization of family dynamics. One report describes interactions in which minor disagreements escalated disproportionately, revealing deeper, unresolved tensions. Arguments that might have been settled with conversation instead became opportunities for manipulation, testing boundaries, or reinforcing control. Allegedly, the family environment became one in which every conversation carried potential consequences, making trust increasingly difficult and fear increasingly palpable. These cracks were not only emotional. They were structural. Allegedly, communication breakdowns began to emerge. Instructions were misunderstood or misinterpreted. Obligations were interpreted differently by different members, and minor transgressions were magnified under the weight of expectation. This created a cycle in which misunderstanding fueled tension, tension fueled fear, and fear fueled more misunderstanding. The cracks widened, invisible to outsiders but profound in impact. Reports suggest that Nick, already under enormous pressure, began to struggle more openly. Emotional volatility, reportedly observed by family members, may have escalated as a response to the dual pressures of the silence pact and the psychological weight of expectations. Every decision became a high-stakes calculation, every action a potential misstep. Allegedly, the family's own strategies to control behavior inadvertently created conditions ripe for conflict. At the same time, Tracy Reiner's influence, while stabilizing in some respects, may have unintentionally magnified stress in others. According to claims, her strategic oversight ensured compliance and protected the family's public image, but it also imposed constraints that limited flexibility. When people are constrained psychologically while under financial and emotional pressure, cracks inevitably appear. They manifest as arguments, withdrawal, resentment, and unpredictable behavior. The alleged fractures were further complicated by conflicting loyalties. Nick was reportedly navigating expectations from multiple family members, each with their own priorities, strategies, and interpretations of the pact.